Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines gets a bad rap all too often from movie audiences and critics, but is it really deserving of so much scorn? Here's my review. Terminator 2 Judgment Day is widely considered to be one of the greatest action sci-fi films of the 90s, so it was always going to be a very tough act to follow. I think in large part, many critics were not in favor of seeing another movie in the franchise, as the second film was such a definitive outing that following it up with a sequel would just cheapen it to a certain extent. But Hollywood, being the cash-hungry industry it is, remained true to its philosophy of, if a film is popular enough, a sequel, prequel, or reboot must follow. Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines was a long time coming, 12 years in total. Released in 2003, but Schwarzenegger had held up pretty well over the years, so he was able to play the Terminator pretty convincingly. Incidentally, a little bit of trivia here, not only is he playing a different T-101 cyborg, obviously, but this is actually a different version. This isn't a T-800, it's a T-850, featuring additional subroutines related to human psychology, which the T-800 from Terminator 2 didn't have. Anyway, the film follows the same basic structure and format as the first two films, more closely resembling the second film. Skynet has sent a Terminator back in time to kill John Connor and the people who will one day become his senior lieutenants in the future resistance wars against the machines. Simultaneously, the Resistance has also sent back a Terminator, a T-101, to protect him, although we later discover that he's programmed to primarily follow the instructions of a new character, Katherine Brewster, John Connor's love interest in this film. If you look at the film in an entirely superficial manner, it would outwardly appear to be nothing more than a repackaging of Judgment Day, and to a large extent, it is, but it's the subtle new additions and variations to the plot that really make a significant difference overall. Terminator 3 reproduces aspects of the first two films, conventions like Arnie walking into a bar naked to acquire clothes, or facing down the TX in a manner somewhat similar to the T-1000, but it never does it in a way that feels like it's desecrating Terminator 2, in a way that Terminator Genisys sullied the franchise by literally recreating and then vandalizing the legacy of the original movies. Over a decade has passed since Sarah and John Connor successfully stopped Judgment Day with the help of the previous Terminator, but in truth, they merely postponed it. Skynet are now trying again, this time sending back a much more powerful Terminator called the TX, described in the movie as a kind of anti-Terminator Terminator, a female cyborg with the power to control other machines. What I like about this conflict is that Arnie's T-101/T-850 is seriously up against it in this film. Not only is he significantly outmatched technologically and in terms of strength, speed, and intelligence when compared to the TX, he's actually an obsolete design. This makes for a compelling underdog story for this T-101 model. This version is outdated, due for the scrap heap, and past his sell-by date. Who knows, maybe his last iOS software update has deliberately slowed him down to preserve his battery life, or some other such excuse. Incidentally, he actually suffers a major fusion cell failure, which foreshadows how he will end up destroying the TX. Anyway, John Connor is an adult now. He's on the road, living off the grid, he's developed a drug problem, and lives with a nagging fear in the back of his mind that this Judgment Day thing isn't over. His mother, Sarah, has passed away. I think the film works perfectly fine without Linda Hamilton's character, though she's still very much missed, and there's some inconvenient backstory related to her death that has to be explained away. Katherine Brewster is a vet and daughter of a military general dealing with a computer virus at an Air Force base. Skynet is being developed as a new security system, but when they deploy it to defeat the virus, it becomes self-aware and the countdown to Judgment Day begins. The T-101 locates John and Katherine in an animal shelter just before the TX arrives, and they escape to the desert after a massively destructive chase through an urban area. John and Katherine realize that they had previously met as teenagers during events preceding the previous film, suggesting that they were destined to meet and that the timeline is realigning to bring them together. Katherine is at first hugely skeptical, but she's later convinced when her fiancé is killed by the TX and she observes it shapeshift right in front of her eyes. The TX isn't made from liquid metal like the T-1000 was. It possesses a skeletal structure but can alter its appearance and features a range of sophisticated built-in weaponry. The T-101's primary mission is to get Katherine and John to safety in a fallout shelter in Mexico. But John refuses to comply and instead threatens to kill himself if the Terminator doesn't take him to General Brewster's Air Force base to confront Skynet directly. Though the T-101 complies, it's ultimately futile. Their fates have been decided, and Judgment Day cannot be stopped, only survived. At the Air Force Base, Katherine's father is killed, and the TX and the T-101 have their massive fight, with the T-101 getting very badly crippled and then taken over by the TX. Just as Katherine and John are about to escape in a light aircraft, he tries to kill John against his own better programming. John manages to convince him to stop and reminds him of his primary mission, and the Terminator temporarily shuts down, giving them enough time to fly away to the Fallout base. They don't initially realize that the base is nothing more than a nuclear fallout shelter. John had convinced himself that it was the system core of Skynet. The heavily damaged Terminators have one last struggle to complete their respective missions, with Arnie forcing his remaining power cell down the throat of the TX and destroying them both. John and Katherine survive the nuclear blasts as the missiles are launched by Skynet globally. There's something very visually and thematically poignant about the ending of this film. Though it's not a happy ending, as the world is literally being destroyed, there is some kind of hopeful message for the future, that mankind must endure the apocalyptic darkness before it will rise once again and see the light. John becomes the leader of the resistance, as he was destined to, with Katherine Brewster at his side. Terminator 3 has its problems. I think Jonathan Mostow does a very good job overall, but this film has several moments of borderline self-parody. There's just a little bit too much humor there. Most notably, the stripper shades gag and the talk to the hand gag, and one or two other witty quips here and there that may be funny but just seem really out of place and inappropriate for this kind of franchise. The dark and foreboding tone of Terminator 2 is completely absent in this film, and when it tries to emulate it in any way, it just fails. The TX also lacks the on-screen presence and terror of Robert Patrick's T-1000, though it's probably unfair to compare the two, it's hard not to want to contrast them. I did appreciate more development of the quasi-father figure role that Arnie's Terminator has been to John. This was something hinted at in Terminator 2. Despite being a different model, John has a strange bond with this machine, and in fact, Skynet realized this, and sometime in the future, the T-101 reveals that John's emotional connection to that particular model was used against him. Apparently, before this Terminator was reprogrammed in the future, it had killed John, though this has never been fully followed up on. I enjoyed the action set pieces, and the special effects are still top drawer. I mean, they still hold up today. But because Terminator 2 was so visually groundbreaking for the time, Terminator 3 could never hope to generate the same impact. When it comes to their commonalities, there's very little in Terminator 3 that Terminator 2 doesn't do better. That said, was Terminator 3 really that bad? No, not at all. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is actually a pretty decent movie that gets unfairly criticized. It's an enjoyable popcorn action movie that's streets ahead of Genesis and Salvation, and while it's not on par with Terminator 2, few action sci-fi films are. Though it doesn't hit the highs of Terminator 2, it's not a million miles away either, and I think it's a worthy addition to this franchise. I think it adds some reasonable value to the series, and though its contribution isn't as significant as the first two films, it doesn't detract or undermine them either. Terminator 3 at least offers a few new components to the Terminator series, though it's very possible that James Cameron will ignore all of them when he makes Terminator 6, as he considers the last three Terminator movies to be bad dreams. Well, at any rate, the most significant contribution that Terminator 3 makes, of course, is that of bringing about Judgment Day and also exploring notions of the inevitability of fate and determinism. There's a nobility in how we face impossible odds and catastrophic defeat and how we recover from it. That's what defines us as human beings, and it's what makes us different from the machines. Terminator 3 is worth watching if you haven't seen it, and generally speaking, I think it's an underrated movie.